Welcome. Thank you all for coming. I would like to thank my colleagues, Howard Fisher, David Levine, and Elizabeth Engel, as well as the many people on the college staff who have made this occasion possible. We will have 7 speakers in the following order. David Levine, Elizabeth Engel, Seth Applebaum. Seth's remarks will be read by me. Claudia Hauer. Claudia's remarks will be read by Howard Fisher, and then Howard Fisher, and then Janet Doherty, and then me, Frank Hunt. So I'll just ask you all to come up in turn.
Is this okay? Yes. I knew Bob since 1963. I first knew him, however, as Mr. Sachs. He was the senior resident of Pinckney Dorm in Annapolis when I was a freshman, 60 plus years. There are 2 things I remember from those days. Someone once asked him if we gave him a lot of trouble. He replied that when we were doing mischief, and we were probably doing mischief, and we spied him, we'd simply say, "Here comes Mr. Sachs," and that was the end of it. Those were different times. What struck us all at the time was his bicycle, or tricycle, a very large-wheeled tricycle that he rode around Annapolis. It was then that I came to realize that this remarkable man was not going to allow his physical disability to define him. About his cerebral palsy, he told me that it was the result of a medical accident, oxygen deprivation during birth. When growing up, however, the doctors and teachers regularly misdiagnosed him as retarded. But his mother knew better. In his early years, she fought for him to get a proper and regular education, and what a result. What the palsy meant for his life, however, was that every action he took required extra effort. Everything he did was an effort. Everything. What is thus remarkable about Bob is many things. His mother, who saved him for a productive life. His genius, which refused to be locked up in his crazy body, as he called it. But most of all, his life itself. That given, that given the ever-present limitations, he could teach, write, and publish, be an active member of our community, and a friend to many of us. A true wonder, my daughter called him. Many have wondered about his very disability-unfriendly house that he designed and built for himself with its sunken living room and stairs, its 2 stories with a circular staircase, a house heated by wood that he'd have to carry in from the woodpile outside to his downstairs fireplace and then up to his study. The most effort-filled house one could imagine. On top of this, at one time, he had 3 dogs that never seemed to get in the way. Why such a house? There's a story to be told and a lesson to be learned. One semester, he was appointed as a visiting professor at Middlebury College. There, they put him up in a guest apartment and assigned 2 students to help him with shopping and chores, etc. For all their well-meaning efforts, his cerebral palsy only got worse. To have other people do for him instead of himself meant he was not able to maintain the muscle tone and strength to daily get the better of his palsy. We may take this as a lesson at St. John's. We must learn for ourselves lest we lose our capacity to learn. He understood suffering. Since I had kept in touch with him over the years, before I returned to Santa Fe, I asked him when I was appointed if I could stay with him until my house was ready. I was coming off a divorce, and he understood the disorientation and disconnectedness I was experiencing. Not by words, but by quiet deeds, he helped me make my way back into the college. And now for the most humiliating experience of my life. Years later, when I was having another house built, I asked if I could stay with him for a month or two, or so I thought. 9 months later, my dog and I moved out. Not once did he think I was an imposition, though it might have been. I paid rent, did chores, cooked some, but never once did he consider me as anything but a friend and a colleague. I would get up around 6 o'clock in the morning. Bob was already up. He didn't sleep well. And his first questions were always about Apollonius or Racine, whatever I was teaching at the time. In losing Bob, we thus lose much. We lost a model of dedication whose commitment to the program was exemplary. We lost a model of imagination and intellect, one of the most interesting mathematical imaginations I've ever encountered. And we lost someone who understood friendship. Those who didn't have a chance to know him or didn't make the effort lost the opportunity to know a genuine original. It is a Jewish tradition to say, at the end of a memorial service, may the memory of the person be a blessing. In our case, we already know that his life and memory are a blessing.
Bob was my friend for almost 50 years. He was brilliant, of course, but I think that it was his curiosity and delight that were the foundation of that brilliance. He delighted in so many things: students, friends, children, new insights, conversations, dogs, riding his tricycle. Obviously, the tricycle made a mark on many of us. Using a food processor to chop vegetables. He could finally make tabbouleh. He was thrilled by that. The whole world was available for his delight. I've wondered if he was courageous. He was, if that just means that he just did what he could, and he could do just about everything. He would walk up and down the steep rocky hill to my house, not going the long way by the road, which would have been 2.5 miles or so. This was maybe 3/4 of a mile. And it was full of loose rock. I decided it was way too risky for my horse. He and his dogs would come to visit up that hill. He would tuck a kettle of boiling water under his arm to make Turkish coffee, which terrified me the first time I saw it, but it was just what he did. His driving, his cousin is going to speak about his driving, but many of his passengers may have worried. But we used to drive back and forth to seminar, and it was such a pleasure until I realized that he would talk to anybody to any hour of the night. And I had to go to sleep by midnight to be functional the next day. I could not stay at the college until 1 o'clock, just so that he could talk. 6 or 7 years ago, we began meeting weekly to read and discuss text together, first at his house and then over Skype. Shakespeare sonnets, Ovid, A Midsummer Night's Dream, Leibniz, who Bob said came closest to describing the world as he saw it. More sonnets. I'm going to read the last Shakespeare sonnet we looked at together, 73, which is probably familiar to many of you, which Bob said was especially important to him as he approached his death. That time of year thou mayst in me behold, when yellow leaves, or none, or few, do hang upon those boughs which shake against the cold, bare ruined choirs where late the sweet birds sang. In me thou seest the twilight of such day as after sunset fadeth in the west, which by and by black night doth take away, death's second self that seals up all in rest. In me thou seest the glowing of such fire that on the ashes of his youth doth lie, as the deathbed whereon it must expire, consumed with that which it was nourished by. This thou perceivest, which makes thy love more strong, to love that well which thou must leave ere long. We'd been reading a couple of sonnets a week, and this one just was the one that came up, although it was the last time we tried to talk about a text together. And he pointed out that it was the self speaking to the self, as well as the self speaking to the other, and about him. And this is my construing of what he said. He loved so well that life, which he knew he was going to leave very soon. So I love this picture, the one on this end, because he just looks so happy. And that, he could get in arguments with people and be angry and not stand for certain things. But happiness, I think, was his strongest mode. So thank you all.
I will read the following statement from Seth Applebaum. Although I met Mr. Sachs relatively recently, compared to many here, the way of my life was greatly affected by reading his commentary on Genesis, The Lion and the Ass. He taught me and generations of students how to begin to read the Bible. I feel extremely lucky to have met him in person when I began teaching at the college. He was so gracious to me and treated me with a warmth and ease, excuse me, as if he'd known me for much longer. Whenever we saw each other, he always asked about what I was working on and had many questions about my life as a new tutor. I feel fortunate indeed that we were able to have a conversation shortly before he passed. Among other things, we spoke about Plato's Timaeus and the conditions that allow philosophy. I was amazed at his equanimity and commitment to the life of the mind up until the end. At his funeral, I was so impressed by the broad range of people in the crowd, which included many members of the Jewish community and the St. John's community as well. Bob is still very much present for his colleagues and friends here at the college. Over the summer, there was a study group on his commentary on the Book of Job. This way of honoring Bob by studying his work together is very much in both the St. John's and Jewish tradition. The most suitable praise I can give Bob is to say that he was a trusted advisor in the court of the great king. I could have counted on Bob to know exactly what I meant by that cryptic remark, but I'll spell it out. This is Leo Strauss's praise of Isaac Albo, a commentator on Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed. And a very high praise indeed. May Bob's memory be a blessing.
These remarks are from Claudia Hauer. It's my privilege to read them on her behalf. A few years after I started at the college, I moved rent-free into Bob's guest house on his property on Timberwick Road. It was a very basic cabin. Its glory was that one wall was entirely glass. I would wake up to rabbit tracks in the snow in the winter and bunnies and birds in the summer. Every few days I would wander over to Bob's house. We had a standing arrangement that I would just let myself in and call out to him. I would find him in the back living room with the wood stove on, perhaps, or up the laborious spiral staircase in his study. We would talk about anything and everything. Sometimes Charlie and Alan would stop by with flowers or fruit. And Bob would make us espresso using his old-fashioned espresso maker. We would drink it at the picnic table in his kitchen or take it out to his garden through the little hobbit door. Despite his cerebral palsy, Bob rejected the notion of convenience. He lived each moment of life deliberately and did not pick up a tool unless its use served some carefully chosen moral function in his material life. Bob understood that a human's use of techne has an intrinsic moral aspect, and Bob was a homo faber, a maker man. In his own way, despite the physical challenges he faced, Bob was a craftsman. I understand his scholarship to be craftsmanship. Bob's intellectual life was that of a craftsman. It was a privilege to have been able to share Bob's space during those years and see firsthand the profundity of his life. Thanks to Claudia Hauer for those recollections. Now I would like to offer a few remarks of my own concerning Bob Sax's way of reading. Bob was profoundly suspicious of any method of reading, but he did admit to having developed a way. The difference, he once explained, was this: a method is a tool with which we come to a work, a resource developed in advance prior to our encounter with the work itself. A way, in contrast, does not enjoy an a priori existence. It comes to be both in and through the very progress of our reading. Bob's way of reading, especially of reading the Hebrew Bible, was particularly responsive to echoes of words, phrases, and themes that one had encountered before. It was equally aware of corresponding contrasts, occasions where we might have expected an echo, but where silence or variation emerges instead. Let me give some examples. In chapter 12 of Genesis, we read that Abram pitched his tent and built an altar, I quote, with Bet-El on the west and Ai on the east. Those words are from verse 8. As Robert himself reports, he was struck by those words, for they seemed to him familiar. They seemed to be the echo of something, And then he recalled that almost the very same words would be used much later in the book of Joshua to locate the place where Joshua would set his men for a second battle. The first had ended in disaster in the territory of the Promised Land. I'll quote from Joshua, chapter 8, verse 9. And Joshua sent them forth, and they stood between Bethel and Ai on the west side of Ai. The words were indeed an echo. They were the echo of a previous reading. With this realization, Bob began to sense a possible connection between Abram's altar and the site of Joshua's battle. But what kind of connection? He asked himself, was Abram somehow aware that he was preparing a way? Or did Joshua somehow know that a way had already been prepared? For some examples of deviation from an expected echo, consider Genesis chapter 1, verses 20 through 22, which describe the fifth day of creation. Up to now, features of the universe, the firmament, the two great lights, were made, Hebrew ya'as. But in verse 21, the verb changes. The denizens of the sea are not made, but created, yivra. Until now, God's third-person imperatives, let there be, were followed by the confirmatory phrase, and it was so, vayehi chen. But in these verses, defying our expectations, those words do not appear. Here also, for the first time, God offers a blessing, be fruitful and multiply. We habitually think of those benevolent words primarily in connection with mankind, created on the sixth day. But they were actually uttered on the fifth day and bestowed upon fish. Why do these creatures enjoy a blessing, while light, the firmament, and the waters do not? Bob used to explain that humans and fishes stand apart by not being so, chen. That is, not fixed, not established. In Robert's reading, that is why humans and fishes require a blessing. The greater light follows the ecliptic. The lesser light wanders, it's true, but only within limits, and it always returns. Fishes, however, may roam anywhere throughout their liquid, apparently featureless world. As Bob writes, the way was not marked out for them from the beginning. Land animals, in contrast, adhere to the norm. They are made, not created. They are said to be so, and they receive no blessing. We might find this puzzling. With respect to occupation of territory, it is not clear why humans should be counted any less so than other land animals. Both, in contrast to fishes, are equally constrained by topography. But the way that is relevant to human beings is not a geographical one. It is a way of life. And since humans will prove to be so spectacularly capable of wandering far from the way that is good, they too require a blessing. Thus, for Bob, repetition and contrast, echo and silence shape our reading. And since this can hardly happen on a first reading, it may seem that, for Bob, reading doesn't really begin until one embarks upon one's second or subsequent reading of a work. There is much to be said in favor of that maxim, which does not in the least disparage first readings. But Bob was also fond of pointing out an example that is more ambiguous. When rereading Hamlet, we cannot experience the opening scene, the ominous stalking of the ghost, aloof and remote, without coloring it in light of what we know is to come. Yet that drama has embedded itself so deeply into public culture that for many readers, even a first reading is likely to reactivate fragments of memory, dim platitudes retained perhaps from early schooling. Oh, yes, Hamlet will eventually kill the king. In this hectic age, we are continually buffeted by the new, the trending, by firsts or alleged firsts of all kinds. Bob found a very different picture in the structure of biblical narrative. The biblical author, he used to say, understood life to be a slow process of remembering and forgetting. Events and traditions buried themselves deep in the land, tied to a specific location, to a certain tree, to a particular well. They would repeatedly fade into silence, then re-emerge with unsuspected meanings. When we read and study works which, like the Hebrew Bible, are steeped in such echoes, we learn to recapture that rich inheritance of literary characters, cultural tropes, and historical signposts that still live deep in our being, sometimes consciously, oftentimes not. Robert's way of reading, then, is also a way of living, for by pursuing it, we energize a deeper awareness of traditions, levels of meaning, connectedness. The good life is not perhaps a goal to be achieved, but rather an ongoing participation in acts of recollection and re-evaluation, in acts of discovery and rediscovery, of apprehending and feeling connections, both of place and time. This worthy reminder is only one of the innumerably many gifts which Bob has left to us all. Thank you.
In Disney's Alice in Wonderland, In Disney's Alice in Wonderland, Alice asks the Cheshire Cat, who sometimes appears only as a disembodied smile, which way to go. He responds that which way to go depends upon where you want to arrive. When Alice says it doesn't much matter, the cat responds that it doesn't much matter, then which way she goes. Alice must see her way for herself. I could tell you about the first time I saw Bob. He was leading a geometrical inquiry on a wobbly blackboard out on the grassy knoll. And I could tell you about the dinners he prepared for us guests in his house with the implausible staircase. He proudly and graciously offered us homemade cheese and pork chops. It was always pork chops. But Bob Sachs, I'm having trouble seeing. But Bob Sachs was and remains for me, first of all, a Cheshire Cat-like teacher, whose gradual corporeal dwindling I observed over the last few years of his life, while his mind and his voice remained strong. In our Zoom meetings last fall, he and I were reading Heidegger's essay concerning technology. In about 6 meetings, we got through about a third of the text. Our readings involved his effort, a physical effort, to articulate his thoughts, and mine to articulate what I thought I saw. This led to Bob's questions that often began, "Does that mean?" Questions that alerted me to self-reflection as well as to the complexities of the issues. He understood better than I what I meant to say, or at least the implications of what I said or meant. So I would revise and rethink, and we would start again with a new bit of text and new questions. These conversations contributed at least as much to my self-knowledge as to knowledge of Heidegger's thought. Just this summer, when I reread the David story to prepare for a class, Bob's assertion that David must return to his origins as he works towards claiming his kingship helped me begin to make sense of David's path. That he must encounter his fish-like beginning, ill-defined and disordered, shed new light on David's sojourn with the Philistines, his remarkable strengths as a leader along with his failures as a man and as a father. All this, along with his sturdy acceptance of the task God and his people had given him. The new order, long in developing, an Israelite nation ruled by kings who established God's laws, is neither given by God nor natural to man. Its imperfection demands repeated review of its origins. David's task is never complete, nor is it without hope. The world is receptive to human effort. We read Shakespeare's Tempest, too, in that class. It is a play I've read many times and written on with some confidence. This time, I tried to see Prospero's task through Bob's emphasis in The Broken Staff, his lecture on the Tempest, on the need to reconcile land and sea. Again, an ordered and grounded whole must emerge through human endeavor out of the chaos of the sea. Human life, including political life, is a constant challenge because we are not made so, with a definite nature or path. Prospero's generosity towards others develops along with his awareness of his kind. He creates a memory of goodness to sustain the future of the brave new world. Each of the characters, according to the kindly Gonzalo, has found himself when he was not his own. Prospero's power opened up the way, but can their self-knowledge, shaped by the image of goodness, endure? It can be only as effectual as their ability to recognize themselves in Prospero's and Shakespeare's magical worlds. And once the staff is broken and buried, it is they, or rather, we, who must recollect the power of Prospero's art and integrate it somehow into actual living. In his essay entitled Recollection, Bob provides a sense of his search for self-knowledge, following the lead of Jacob Klein. For Klein, he says, and I'm quoting, "Facing the world meant coming to terms with those books and thinkers who have helped to form us through our to form us and our ways of thought, not because we had read them, but precisely because we had not read them, but only absorbed them passively and thoughtlessly. To understand ourselves, then, means to see one's particular horizon opening up by reconsidering the labor of the thinker for whom it first opened, and to listen to his own voice. Knowledge, for Klein, was not something that could be written down in a book. Knowledge demanded our own voice." Bob found his own voice through examining carefully the works of both ancients and moderns. In an interview in 1999, Bob said, I'm quoting, "When I try to understand myself, I find that the self I want to understand is partly hidden between dusty books, unopened for hundreds of years," end quote. His writings constitute a self-examination in which the hidden self the ghostly thoughts that once lay buried come to life. Reading the full range of texts of the Western tradition provided opportunities to reawaken the ghosts of his soul and to enter into conversation with the authors of the horizons they inhabited. The goal of this endeavor was the honest confrontation with the world in which Bob found himself, a world that makes too much sense to make no sense, and which persists in resisting definitive claims. It is part of the tradition of the college to talk about education as a process of desedimentation, the process of tracing back our prejudices to their original forms in books by great thinkers who present them in coherent accounts or images which we can examine. Eventually, we hope to come to terms with what we find in these books and take responsibility for accepting or modifying or simply rejecting the thoughts we have come to recognize as borrowed. This is the ongoing endeavor of our classes for both tutors and students. But how do the books facilitate the discovery or creation of one's own voice? For Bob, the inquiry into great books was clearly personal, even while it yielded understanding that could be shared with others. His readings of biblical texts are more than expressions of his unique experience with the texts he discusses. They provide insights that help to open up the horizons of others by illuminating the way each story displays recognizable human experience. No dogmas, but a way of witnessing the dialogue among authors of various texts comes into focus. Bob asks in his essay on Samson's riddle, quote, "How can David be a teacher when there is nothing to be taught?" End quote. David must find his way knowing that he cannot know he will prevail. His struggles, in which success is often tainted with moral failure, pale next to Job's. The book of Job contrasts Job's undeserved suffering with the revelation of God's presence and the opening up of a broader horizon in which human life looks different. Without Job's experience of revelation, the resistance of the world to intelligible account, especially any account of its justice, is for him intolerable. But without direct evidence of God's presence, how do we readers assess our relations to the unintelligible world we inhabit? The reading of great books does not often lead to definitive teachings. It is a personal undertaking for any of us who, striving for self-knowledge, recognize that our origins become clearer through the reading of these books. We too have a stake in the persisting questions and the range of possible responses to them that the great books of the Western tradition represent. But there is no readily available answer to the question whether we are getting in touch with something like nous, mind simply, or whether we are merely, though it is no small thing, coming to terms with the multiple influences that have shaped our individual souls. Our investigation into the books is in part an opening of the particular array of dusty tones that constitute our origins, American or European, Christian or Jew. When our horizon opens up, we are freed to see the things that are. If we can hone our vision, when our horizon opens up, are we freed to see the things that are if we can hone our vision? Or are we in an interminable process of pursuing horizons beyond horizons of our individual souls, souls which have much in common with others, but maintain our individuality? Like Bob, our hope of speaking with our own voices is to listen for the echoes of the earlier thinkers and engage with them. And one of the questions we encounter in doing so is whether souls are more same than other, and what form or forms truth takes. Self-knowledge is in part the knowledge of persisting questions. The contest between land and sea, like the dialectic between Athens and Jerusalem, is unending. Bob's persistent, genuine engagement with the wide range of questions that arise in the Western tradition is a model that few can imitate. His voice endures.
My apologies, my voice is a little scratchy today. As Seth mentioned in his remarks that I read earlier, this past summer on the Santa Fe campus, a small faculty study group read and discussed Bob's translation of and commentary on the Book of Job. I would like to thank the participants in that group for their thoughts and insights, and say a few words about Bob's commentary. Bob had earlier written a detailed commentary on the book of Genesis entitled The Lion and the Ass, which was originally published serially in the journal Interpretation beginning in 1980. The title refers to a passage in 1 Kings 13:24, describing the death of a man of God, a prophet. And I'll quote from 1 Kings. "And when he was gone, the prophet, a lion met him by the way and slew him, and his carcass was cast in the way. And the ass stood by it, and the lion also stood by the carcass." In Bob's reading, and I quote here, "The lion is the spirit of the founders and refounders of the biblical tradition, who overturn in order to preserve it. Figures like Abraham, Jacob, Moses, David, and Josiah. In contrast, Isaac and the many other in-between generations, like that constant and resolute beast of burden, the ass, carry the ponderous inheritance called tradition on their backs. Together they guard the promise of the man of God." Bob reads the book of Job in part as a response, or as I would like to put it, a counterstatement to the book of Genesis, in part. In my remarks today, I will briefly comment on that aspect of Bob's commentary. Here I rely primarily upon his interpretation of what the voice of God speaks to Job out of the tempest, beginning in chapter 38. As a result of his afflictions, Job finds himself in the sudden realization that the surface of the world as it lay before him had fallen out of harmony with the wisdom of the ages. The home of man as it has been defined by the wisdom of the fathers, for Job that world has begun to crack. Job, like the Socrates of the Apology, who questions the Delphic oracle's declaration that no one is wiser than Socrates, suggests a need to reconsider our notion of true piety. In the vision granted him by the voice out of the tempest, Job has crossed the veil which separates the human from the non-human. He has entered into the land of jackals. Twice the Lord tells Job to gird up your loins like a hero. For Elihu, the great world beyond the human realm is full of terror. Man has not the stamina to face what lies beyond his own horizons, and must be kept from peering beyond, those horizons. For Job, however, the need to see for oneself keeps reasserting itself. Bob uses the term horizon in a distinctly Husserlian sense. For Husserl, a horizon is always an invitation, something one could go out into and beyond. Here's Bob again. If Elihu had not been nearly right, there would be no need for Job to gird his loins. And yet, if Elihu were simply right, God's exhortations would have all been in vain. As Bob puts it, the question is this: are the frightful things in nature to be destroyed one day by the hand of God so that the world might truly become a world for man? Or do those things have a certain beauty of their own, apart from all human need? A frightful beauty, yet one to which man could be open, and under which he first learns to be a human being. The voice from the tempest has introduced us to the second alternative, while denying the first. The second, indeed, has replaced the first. We are in the presence of nature. Biblical Hebrew does not, as Bob points out, Biblical Hebrew does not have a word for nature, a term that is central to Greek philosophy. Bob observes that there are two Hebrew words for seal or signet ring, hotam and teva, and that the second word, teva, eventually gave rise to the post-biblical word used to translate the Greek physis, or nature. Tradition shows the root which emphasizes the fact that the mark of the signet ring is impressed upon the object from outside. The book of Job, on the other hand, chooses the one which emphasizes the guaranteed character of the object itself. For the author of the book of Job, the word hotam is beginning to acquire, Bob says, the character of the Greek physis. It represents the discovery of nature. We therefore see in the book of Job something like Greek philosophy beginning to emerge in the context of the Hebrew Bible. We begin to see this in Job's encounter with the 6 non-mythical wild beasts in chapter 39. The mountain goat, the wild ass, the wild ox, the ostrich, the horse, and the hawk and eagle. The hawk and eagle somehow get lumped together. So, here we find, as Bob puts it, a world full of life and living creatures, a world larger, stranger, and more violent, but at times curiously more tender than any man had ever seen. But at all times it is breathtakingly beautiful, and we stand in awe of that which does not know us. As Bob remarks, here there's no indication that the pain of birth is the result of a curse, or that it is punishment for having tasted a forbidden fruit. That remains painful, of course. Here, perhaps for the first time, we can begin to see in the world beyond our world an ordered whole, with its own necessities, and one which seems to be totally indifferent to our own sense of order. The description of the wild ass begins with a series of rhetorical questions. Who sent the wild ass off to be free? And who has untied the reins of the untamed Jenny, whose home I've made the wilderness, and who dwells off in the salt lands? But the text continues. The wild ass laughs at the bustling of the city and does not even hear the driver's shout, but roams the hills as his pasture, and every green thing is his to search out. Seeing the wild ass as being endowed with a life of its own, roaming the hills as its pasture, it's freedom. Freedom from bondage to human beings, but also freedom from bondage to human arts and tradition comes into prominence for us. Here, there is something like an anticipation of the idea that will later, as Bob says, be apprehended in the form of natural right. But the significance of the encounter with nature and the contrast with Genesis is confirmed especially by Bob's reading of the vision of the Leviathan that Job receives from the voice out of the tempest in chapter 41. We remember that earlier the voice had said to Job of the Leviathan, perhaps somewhat playfully, "Can you haul Leviathan in with a fishhook? Will he make a covenant with you to be your eternal servant? Can you play with him like a bird or tie him on a string for your young ladies?" That's a somewhat facetious God. In Job 41:25, it is said of the Leviathan, "No one of the dust will have dominion over him, for he was made to be without fear." As Bob observes, the word used here for fear, in fact, appears in only one other passage in the whole of biblical literature. The passage is Genesis 9:2, where God says to Noah and his sons after the flood, "Panic and fear of you shall rest on every animal of the earth and on every bird of the air, on everything that creeps on the ground, and on all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered." This passage that I just read is consistent with Genesis 1:28, where God had said to the newly created humans, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." This is, of course, a passage that thinkers like Francis Bacon will appropriate in the 17th century in their rhetorical effort to enlist mankind in the modern project of the conquest of nature. Okay. Thus, Job 41:25, where the Leviathan is said to be made to be without fear. Job 41:25 emerges, Bob says, and perhaps intentionally so, as a corrective to Genesis 9:2, and perhaps to the book of Genesis as a whole. Job has come to learn from nature, not to conquer it. As Bob remarks about the Leviathan, this grand beast, above and beneath all malice or ambition, oblivious to all, rules all by the mere weight of his being. In him we recognize our limitations and hence see our definition. That's Bob. Almost done. The vision that Job has received out of the world, beyond the world of man, reverberates within the human sphere. In a passage that echoes Act 3 of King Lear, Bob writes, "The world beyond man is not a world in which man can play. It is only a world in which he can learn about play. To see it is to see it as a thing for itself, not a thing for us. But our brush with it will greatly change life in our little world of man." Thank you. There will be a reception on the Library of Bosika. Yes, and I think what our intention about that was that we will have a speaker down on the Bosita. Yes, and certainly others are welcome to speak if they wish to do so. Yeah, is that
Yes.
that what we're planning on?
There should be a microphone in the tent along with refreshments.
Yes. Thank you all. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.